Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and yeah, the new ranked season has just begun, and the beginning of these ranked seasons can be kind of difficult, mainly because they coincide with the release of a new expansion. So we have all of these new cards, all of these new decks, so it's difficult to know what deck and what strategy that you should be using to climb and play ranked battles in Pokemon TCG Pocket. That's what we're going to be covering in today's video. Of course, what are the best decks to be playing right now in ranked mode, at least at the beginning of this new format? I think a lot of people thought that this expansion or this mini set wasn't that great, but one thing I will tell you is that things have been shaken up massively, and there are a ton of awesome new decks that are definitely going to help you grind up to Master Ball and above in Pokemon Pocket for this A3A ranked season. Let's get right into it, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay tuned. We have a ton of content coming over the next couple of weeks on this channel, and this is going to be a great place to go to, stay up to date on, I guess, what decks you should be playing and which decks are the best in the metagame right now. All right, guys. Let's just kick things off by talking about what I believe right now is potentially one of the best decks in the game, and that's a brand new archetype. This is going to be Sylvally with Rampardos. Now, this is something that is probably going to end up being one of the most played decks, if not the most played deck in the format. And the reason I say that is because Rampardos was always really good. It saw play in a variety of different decks last format, but now it definitely feels like we have a great partner for Rampardos that will probably take over all of the meta share that Rampardos had split between all of the different decks last format. And that's going to be Sylvally. So Sylvally is a colorless non-EX Pokemon that can basically do 100 damage for 2 colorless energies, and it's very consistent because we can pair it with Gladion, or Gladion, I'm not exactly sure how to say it, but this is a new supporter card that allows you to search your deck for a Sylvally, or even a type Null, I believe, which is really strong. So Sylvally, you need 2 energies to attack to do 50, but if you play a supporter on the same turn, you do 100 damage. However, we don't need to have Sylvally evolved by the time we play that supporter. We can play a supporter, then evolve Sylvally, and we can still do that 100 damage. So it's a really, really strong Pokemon. Type Null can do 20 or 40 damage for 1 energy as well. And these Pokemon actually have a lot of HP. That's 80 and 110 HP. That's enough to live quite a few turns, honestly, and kind of buy us time to then evolve into Rampardos. This is a purely single prize archetype of Pokemon that can hit for 100 and 130 damage. Rampardos, we all know it. We all love it or hate it. An incredibly strong Pokemon that can do 130 for only 1 energy, and it is a fossil Pokemon. So that's a big reason why Sylvally pairs so well with Rampardos, is that because we're playing fossils, then we're guaranteed to start with type Null. So all we have to do is basically either draw into Sylvally or draw into Gladion, and we can guarantee that on our second or third turn, we're doing that 100 damage with Sylvally, and then, just kind of buying some time before we go into Rampardos. It's incredibly strong. In my mind, definitely the best way to play Rampardos right now. It's actually a kind of hyper consistent. It's really, really difficult to deal with, and this is also a deck that is phenomenally good against Oricorio. I think a big reason why Oricorio might be kind of pushed out of the format to a pretty significant degree is mainly because of this probably new Sylvally in Rampardos deck. So yes, if you have the new Sylvally, it is a holographic rare, which of course the rarity and the pull rates for these holo rares is pretty low. But if you do happen to get 2 copies of Sylvally, I think this is certainly the best way to play it. We're going to take a look at another Sylvally deck later in this video, but this is definitely kind of a front runner for me for one of the best decks of the format. Now, one thing I will say is that there is another really strong deck that's also popular that is good against this archetype, so we're going to talk about that later in the video. But yeah, Sylvally Rampardos is kind of the best new fighting type archetype, kind of taking the place of maybe Garchomp, or I guess Lycanroc Rampardos, or maybe even Lucario Rampardos. I think they're all probably going to get condensed into like just this archetype. Garchomp might see some play later on, but that is of course weak to grass, so it's a little bit difficult to justify playing Garchomp in a format right now. We would probably just rather play Sylvally. It's actually a lot better than I thought it was when I initially saw it. Just really consistent. This is a deck that plays just a ton of supporter cards, so even if we don't play Gladion, we can play a Research that turn, or even Iono, which fits into the deck well. Not only meets the condition for Brave Buddies, the Sylvally attack, but also helps you find your fossils early in the game. We've got a Guzma, a Cyrus, Pokemon Center Lady, a couple of good tech inclusions, and then we also only have to play 1 copy of Pokeball, which is kind of unique. Not a lot of decks do that, but of course, does give the deck a distinct advantage because, again, we're only playing 2 basic Pokemon, so we're guaranteed to start with 1 of them, so only 1 Pokeball is needed, and that opens up space for some other cards in the deck. Again, 2 Skull Fossil and 2 Rare Candy. This deck is certainly really strong. We'll talk about how to counter this deck later in the video, but if you're grinding into ranked battles right now, whether you're in Ultra Ball or in Master Ball, this is certainly a deck you're going to see a lot of, and then once the tournaments come this weekend, you're probably going to end up seeing a lot of this deck list as well. Just really, really strong, really consistent, really difficult to deal with because you're forced to go through 3 three kind of high HP, pretty strong Pokemon. So here it is, Sylvally and Rampardos. Next up, we're going to talk about the other Sylvally deck, which again is, you know, I don't know if it's necessarily as good as Rampardos. However, we can play Oricorio in it. So if Oricorio was something that you enjoyed playing, or if you think that for whatever the reason, Oricorio was a smart decision, which I think is probably less the case in ranked battles right now, mainly because of the Rampardos deck that's running around, which is of course really good against Oricorio. There are some matchups where Oricorio can still win you the game. So this is going to be an electric type Sylvally utilizing the new Zero Aura card, which is also really good because we can play Dawn. So not only are we just playing electric energies in this deck so we can attack with Zero Aura on our second turn if we're going first, is actually pretty strong. We can also play Dawn to set up Sylvally or Oricorio a turn quicker, which is certainly pretty good. Double Pokemon Center Lady, mainly for that Giratina and Darkrai matchup, which is of course where Oricorio was going to shine. Giratina Darkrai still sees a pretty significant amount of play, but because we're not playing any stage 2 Pokemon or anything like that, we have a lot more basic Pokemon, which inherently does make the deck a little bit more consistent. The Rampardos deck, really the downside to this is like, if you don't find your fossils, like you're kind of a sitting duck because your opponent probably just has to go through like 1 or 2 Sylvally, and if they get set up or ramped up, it's kind of easy for them to do that. This is a deck list that has basic Pokemon ready no matter what, right? So whether it's Zero Aura or Type Null or Oricorio, all of our energies or all of our Pokemon are low energy attack costs, so very fast-paced, very consistent. Of course, there are some Pokemon weak to Electric type, but it's not the most relevant thing in the world. This is just a deck that's really fast-paced and aggressive and kind of beats your opponent before they can set up, so it's going to be strong against a lot of those setup decks. Of course, Oricorio, really good in a variety of different scenarios. But what we're seeing right now is basically all of the decks that are reliant on EX Pokemon also play a strong non-EX Pokemon. So I also don't really feel like Oricorio is that strong. You can also just play Magnezone and Oricorio as well. However, you're also going to be weak to this Rampardos deck, so it's tough. It's a tough spot right now. It's hard for me to recommend playing Oricorio, but this is certainly another top way to play Sylvally, and I think it is a really good deck. So if you wanted to play a more consistent, or I guess like fast-paced Sylvally deck, this is going to be a really good option for you. And then maybe Oricorio becomes really good at some point, or maybe you just end up, you know, playing a bunch of decks that Oricorio is going to be good against. This is going to be a really good option. I think one of the new great pairings for Oricorio is Sylvally. Magnezone is still around, so I think that's certainly still a fine deck, but again, with all of the Rampardos decks going around, it's probably tough to justify playing any electric type archetype. But here it is, Zero Aura and Sylvally and Oricorio. Not the only electric type deck that we're going to be talking about in this video. I think that there might be a better option for the electric typing, which has been improved by a variety of different cards, which we'll talk about again in just a little bit. But here it is, Oricorio. I don't know how I feel about Oricorio. That's why I'm not necessarily greatly recommending this particular deck list, but I still think that this deck in general is really good, and probably the number 2 Sylvally option. All right, next up is going to be Giratina and Darkrai. So yes, Giratina and Darkrai I think is still really good in the format. There's a lot of Buzzwole running around. Meowscarada is still kind of floating around, and Oricorio does still see play. So, I mean, there's a lot of, I guess I should say the format right now isn't nearly as good for Giratina and Darkrai as it certainly was in the past. But one thing is for sure is that playing a deck list like this with all, you know, I guess basic EX Pokemon is certainly really, really good and consistent. And instead of maybe playing Komala like we were playing before, now we're able to tech in Nihilego, and then we're playing Poison Barb instead of Rocky Helmet. This really does open things up to counterplay Oricorio much, much more heavily. Not only can we attack with Nihilego for 30 damage, but we're doing 20 damage every turn with the poison. So it's a little bit better, I think, than Rocky Helmet in those few scenarios, plus the Nightmare Aura Ping. So this is a great way to get around playing or losing to Oricorio when you're playing Giratina and Darkrai. But in general, to me, is also just a really great new way to play Giratina and Darkrai. You can bypass the whole Nihilego Poison Barb thing because Oricorio isn't that common. But in general, I think a lot of this poison damage tacked on with the Nightmare Aura damage from Darkrai is actually a lot, and it can set up KOs for Darkrai and Giratina. Buzzwole's running around, and you can get one shot by Buzzwole whether you're playing Giratina or Darkrai, you know, because all of the extra damage modifiers that Buzzwole has, and of course hitting for weakness on Darkrai. So, you know, I mean, there's a lot of scenarios. I think in general, the format right now isn't as kind to Giratina and Darkrai as it was previously, but still a super consistent deck. And this has been a little bit upgraded, and I think kind of probably the better way, or maybe the best way now to play Giratina and Darkrai. We also are playing Dark Energies in this particular deck, so we can utilize the attacks of all 3 Pokemon, and we can attack with Nihilego and Darkrai really consistently. And that's definitely an upside. But we can't, of course, utilize any like Celesteela stuff. There are some other Poison Nihilego dark type decks, which we'll talk about in a little bit in this video, because I think that entire kind of archetype is really strong right now. But again, we just wanted to talk about Giratina and Darkrai, right? We had to mention it in the video because it is certainly a strong choice. And this should be a deck that's fairly easy to build. The only new card that is included here from the new expansion is just this one copy of Nihilego. So it should be fairly easy to build, especially for people that maybe don't have a lot of the new cards from ED Crisis. I think this is ED Crisis. This is going to be a really good option. I think that it kind of improves Giratina Darkrai in a variety of different scenarios. Like I said, still, all of the decks that we're talking about early on, I don't necessarily think are super well positioned. That's why I'm not like talking about them at the end of the video. These decks aren't in really any particular order, I should say, but I typically kind of tend to leave like the best for last in these videos. So the decks at the beginning of this video are all inherently really, really strong. They just maybe aren't super well positioned given the other popular decks in the format, which are kind of the grass decks. But anyway, we'll talk about it in a little bit. All right, there's Giratina and Darkrai. Next up, let's talk about Guzzlord, because Guzzlord is actually a top tier Pokemon in the format right now, even though it's weak to grass, and grass is kind of everywhere. I think the complete dark type Ultra Beast package is quite good. I think that they printed or gave us, 3 different dark Ultra Beast cards and Celesteela, so we can kind of just play dark type and play the full Ultra Beast package. And it's actually quite good. Honestly, I would say this is probably one of the best decks of the current format right now, even though we are, of course, weak to grass, which is very common. Guzzlord has enough HP to just live an attack from a Buzzwole no matter what, right? So that's certainly an upside. Now, this is a deck list, and we'll talk about maybe what I would change about this deck list or how I would maybe edit it a little bit, but this is a really good starting point. This incorporates 2 Poipole, 2 Naganadel, 2 Guzzlord, 2 Nihilego, and 2 Celesteela. So that certainly is a lot of Pokemon, but they all provide value no matter kind of which Pokemon you draw into. Guzzlord, of course, can attack with Grindcore for 2 energies and then discard energy from your opponent. With Poison Barb and Nihilego plus the Naganadel Poison, we are able to do a lot of extra chip damage while we're kind of stalling our opponent. So if they do decide to attack us with Guzzlord, they're going to end up taking, 20 or 40 poison damage plus the Grindcore damage. And then the whole idea with playing Guzzlord in 1 copy of Lusamine means that, even if Guzzlord goes down, or if we kind of go into Naganadel, or even attack with Celesteela or Nihilego, we can kind of accelerate and move those energies from our discard pile to Guzzlord and get it set up a little bit later on. And because we're playing dark energies, there are scenarios, I should say, where maybe we just survive for a long time and we do end up getting 4 energies on Guzzlord, and then we can utilize its Tyrannical Hole attack, another ridiculous name, which does 120, which for 4 energies is a bit steep, but you gotta, understand that Guzzlord has so much HP, it's surviving for so long, we're discarding energies from our opponent, we're able to stall pretty effectively, plus with the Lusamine being able to accelerate maybe some energies to Guzzlord, does kind of allow us to kind of go in and get 4 energies on this a little bit more easily than we otherwise might think we could, and then just start hitting for 120. And with 170 HP plus all of the poison damage, right, that's enough to take a lot of different KOs. We're playing 1 Cyrus, 1 Guzma, which I think Guzma is also still good in the format right now. For a variety of scenarios, I think that there's still a lot of tool cards, whether it is Giant Cape or Leaf Cape or Rocky Helmet or Poison Barb. There's a ton, or even in the Electro type decks with Electrical Cord. Guzma is becoming better and better as more tool cards are being released. So I do think a lot of decks do benefit from playing Guzma, but I think in specifically this deck list utilizes it fairly well. And then Repel. So Repel's a really interesting one. I guess I'll just talk about it specifically for a little bit here. I think that Repel is theoretically a really, really good card. But at the same time, like the only way or the only reason we would ever want to play Repel instead of Sabrina are the scenarios where we want to play another trainer card in that same turn, also have that Repel sort of Sabrina effect. It only works for basic Pokemon, and basic Pokemon are still common in the format, but particularly against like the Sylvally decks, they end up like evolving really early on. It's going to be not really useful against the Ultra Beast decks as well, because they have Celesteela. I mean, again, I guess we are moving them on our turn, so it doesn't really matter because we can force them to swap out and then we can attack whatever that Pokemon was. So it does have its use. I think that ultimately I kind of do still prefer playing Sabrina, but I mean, I guess at the end of the day, playing 1 Repel or 1 Sabrina is not really going to change much. There are going to be scenarios where you wish you didn't have Repel and you wish you had Sabrina because you're not facing down a basic Pokemon. So that definitely happens, but I mean, basic Pokemon are still kind of all over the place. So against Sylvally specifically, it doesn't feel that good, but against like Giratina Darkrai or maybe, the mirror matchup here with Guzzlord or any of the Arceus decks, it certainly does feel like a really strong card. So we're gonna have to wait and see whether Repel is just ends up kind of just being better than Sabrina. It's interesting to say. It certainly is a very I guess polarizing card. It's certainly good, but I don't know. I'm still on the fence whether or not Repel or Sabrina is better. Now, again, in this deck, we can play Guzma, we can play Lusamine, even play Professor's Research in the same turn as we play Repel, which is certainly the upside. So in deck lists where you're kind of reliant on all of your other supporter cards, I think Repel kind of does make sense, but in decks where you maybe aren't so reliant on playing other supporter cards in the same turn, then maybe you would rather just play Sabrina. But either way, yeah. So this Dark type Guzzlord deck is actually just really, really good. It ends up being a really annoying deck to deal with, especially if they get a little bit lucky on the coin flips with Grindcore. Maybe they just sort of bring you up with Repel, or they come in with Cyrus and they bring up the Pokemon that you're attaching energies to, and then they kind of stall for a bit, and then they set up Guzzlord. It's really difficult to deal with. Now, one thing I will say is that we can honestly cut Naganadel from the deck, theoretically, because it is a Pokemon that sometimes doesn't really do anything, right? You can't poison until you evolve into Naganadel. There's no guarantee that you're going to find that stage 1 Pokemon, because it is, there's just, stage 1 Pokemon are a little bit inconsistent in that sense, where you don't really have a way to search it out. We don't have like rare candy, so you just kind of hope that you draw into it. And if we don't, then Poipole is like a basic Pokemon that we can start with that doesn't really provide us any value. So maybe you could cut like one copy of Naganadel or one copy of Poipole, maybe even cut one copy of Nihilego. There are definitely opportunities to cut some of the Pokemon from this deck, and then you could play some more trainer cards. Maybe we could play another Cyrus or another Sabrina. Maybe we could play a Mars. Maybe we could even play Team Rocket Grunt. So I think that this is a really good starting point for this particular archetype. I think it'll probably evolve as time goes on. I think that eventually people might change around the way that this deck is built. In fact, I've even seen some people just kind of skip Naganadel entirely and then have like 4 more slots in your deck. So that's the other downside, right, of playing stage 1 Pokemon, is that they just take up space in your deck, right, for really not that much value. Naganadel 40 plus the 20 damage from poison if Nihilego's on our bench is strong, though, so that can be a really strong early pressure Pokemon. 100 HP is nothing to slouch about either, and it's not weak to grass too, which is an upside. So we're not, I guess, like typically, I guess it doesn't really matter. Buzzwole is KOing us, Decidueye is KOing us anyway. But not being weak to grass is definitely an upside as well. So yeah, this is a really, really interesting deck that I think also has a lot of potential. We'll have to see. I don't know if Guzzlord will necessarily catch on like maybe some of the new archetypes have, like Sylvally or Buzzwole, but it's certainly still one of the strongest decks in the game, and I think that Dark type in general is really strong. So I think mainly at its core, the Guzzlord, Nihilego, Celesteela, and Poison Barb combination is definitely a winner. Whether or not Naganadel's worth playing or not, we'll kind of have to see. Again, it can be really, really good, but also can be a bit useless in some scenarios. Sometimes we would just kind of rather go into Guzzlord. Now, if we are playing Naganadel in Nihilego in the deck, then you kind of end up wanting to go like, a single prize Pokemon into another single prize Pokemon and then finish up with Guzzlord. So I guess it's not terrible in that sense, but for like the prizing math. But again, a lot of times you're just leading with Guzzlord anyway. Celesteela does allow you to have some flexibility in which Pokemon we can bring up into the active spot. But again, would you rather your opponent go through 2 Naganadel and a Guzzlord, or just, would you rather just have like 2 Guzzlord? That's kind of what it comes down to, right? So yeah, you kind of make that decision whether or not you like Naganadel or not. Certainly a strong Pokemon, but whether or not it's something that maybe we need to run in this deck list is definitely up for question. We'll have to see when most people end up doing with this deck list as time goes on. But really good. And Guzzlord's an interesting one because of, its colorless energies and its attack cost. Theoretically, you can play it in a lot of different decks, but I think for the most part, you need some kind of payoff for Guzzlord, and I think it just kind of feels bad if we're not playing dark energies, because then we can never attack with Tyrannical Hull, So I think Guzzlord is really strong, but I think it's probably going to be, I guess, a little bit, locked down to being in dark type decks for the time being. I just think that it's kind of tough to justify playing Guzzlord, even with the 2 colorless energies and Grindcore's attack cost. I think it's hard to justify playing Guzzlord in any decks that aren't dark energy decks. So there you go. But it's still really, really strong. Honestly, I think Guzzlord is going to end up being meta for sure. So the next deck that we're going to talk about is actually Tapu Koko. And Tapu Koko is certainly a really, really strong archetype in the format right now. Electrotype in general has a lot of different stuff going on that's kind of been improved. They did introduce a lot of different strong Electrotype cards in ED Crisis in this new mini set, right? Tapu Koko is kind of the front runner in terms of like, it's the new kind of main attacking Electrotype Pokemon. It does, of course, 20 damage, but then it accelerates energies to itself, and then we can do 90 damage on our second turn. Certainly a Pokemon that would rather go second. That way, on our third turn, we can just start doing 90 damage turn after turn, but With the inclusion of Oricorio plus the new Zeraora card, we have a lot of different options and routes, right? So we're playing Dawn, we're playing Zeraora. Again, electric energies in this deck allows us to just attack with Zeraora or play Dawn to move that energy to like a Pikachu EX or a Tapu Koko EX or even to Oricorio. Because we're playing one copy of Oricorio, we're able to basically just do really well in some specific matchups. So that's the thing about Oricorio is like it's always going to be good enough because there are some games where Oricorio would just win you the game. And that certainly is really, really important. Also, because we are playing a couple single prize Pokemon, we can force our opponent to either go through 2 EX Pokemon or maybe go through 2 single prize Pokemon and then have to deal with an EX Pokemon. The downside to this deck, though, of course, and with all electric type Pokemon right now, is that they have low HP counts, right? We are playing Giant Cape, but for the most part, Pikachu and Tapu Koko, even with Giant Cape, is going to get KO'd by Rampardos, which is really common in the format. So I would say right now, it's kind of difficult to justify playing electric type in general with how popular that Rampardos is becoming with that Sylvally deck and in other Rampardos decks as well that people are still playing. So it kind of puts you in a tough spot, but theoretically this deck is really fast and it's really, really strong. Pikachu EX now has kind of a home. Now we can kind of justify playing Pikachu EX as that final attacking Pokemon to take KOs to end the game. That's really what this card was meant to do, and now it has the support to do so, whether it's with Zeraora, even if we're leading with Pikachu. We have Zeraora to get this thing set up and attack on turn 2 potentially, and we have the new Electrical Core tool card, which allows us to conserve our energies once our active Electric-type Pokemon gets KO'd. And all of our Pokemon have 2+ energies in their attack cost. So no matter which Pokemon is in the active spot, you're going to put 2 energies onto it, hopefully put your electrical cord onto it, and then you're able to go into your next Pokemon much more consistently. Plus with Dawn, a lot of flexibility, a lot of fast pace that this deck has, and it's going to kind of overwhelm some decks that just don't draw the cards they need to. It's a very consistent deck. All of our Pokemon, no matter which Pokemon we lead with, is providing value and can do some damage, so that is certainly a big upside. Not a ton of Pokemon in the deck either, and they're all basics, right? Only 6 Pokemon in the deck, which means we have room for 14 trainer cards, which is good. So decks like this that are playing a variety of basic Pokemon are inherently consistent and inherently really strong, which definitely does give it an upside. I would say that Tapu Koko in this particular deck could be a top tier deck in the metagame as long as the fighting decks don't become too common. We've already seen a really early formulation of like a rock, paper, scissors type thing at the top of the metagame, where we have the grass decks, which are of course good against the, Rampardos Sylvally decks, but then those decks are good against Tapu Koko. So between Buzzwole, Tapu Koko, and then Sylvally Rampardos, there is a little bit of a rock, paper, scissors formulation going on at the top of this new metagame, which is interesting to see super early on, but there's a lot of other players like we've seen with the dark type decks, but there's also Giratina and Darkrai, and I think that the psychic decks are also going to end up being really good. We'll just kind of have to see whether or not they end up seeing play eventually. But yeah, I mean, here it is. So 1 Mars, 1 Guzma, 1 Dawn, 1 Cyrus, and 1 Giovanni. Giovanni's an interesting one, but really it's kind of there for those particular non-EX matchups. Again, Sylvally is a big one, right? Because they could, attach a Giant Cape, or they could play a Pokemon Center later, whatever. It's also there for, I guess, just really any other, non-EX Pokemon which you're going to be facing down, which, are fairly common, theoretically. A lot of the Ultra Beast decks play non-EX Pokemon, whether that's Naganadel or whether that's, Kartana or Pheromosa. There's just a ton of them in the format, or even Celesteela, right? We are hitting Celesteela for weakness, so you got to keep that in mind. Even in the Grass-type matchup, because Celesteela gets hit for weakness, it is actually kind of effective to be, playing Electric-type decks in the format, and Giovanni, of course, can kind of get you there, which is certainly really good. 90 plus 20 from weakness is 110, plus Giovanni is 120. That's going to KO a Celesteela for sure. So yeah, really, really strong deck, honestly. I think the only thing holding back Tapu Koko in this new and improved Electro-type aggro archetype is just going to be those Rampardos decks, which I covered at the beginning of the video because I think that they're becoming massively popular. So it kind of defines, I guess, the positioning for all of the decks that we're talking about after that. That's why I put it at the beginning of the video. I think it's massively popular and is also just, in general, I think probably one of the best decks to be playing in the format. So yeah, anyway, here's Tapu Koko. A variety of players have been using this and doing really well with it early on. I believe this deck list was the list that Jody was playing early on. He brought it to the Frog EX tournament, and I think went undefeated or close to in day 1. So did really well with it. It's a really strong deck, very well built, and piloted by, of course, a really strong player. So really, really good. And if you want to know more about this deck, you could probably go maybe check out his YouTube channel. He probably has some content on it. I'm not exactly sure, but he probably does because he's been playing it and he's makes great content. So definitely go check him out. But yeah, here it is. Tapu Koko, Zeraora, Oricorio, and then the new Pikachu, or the, not the new, but the newer Pikachu EX, which is actually a really strong Pokemon. It was just, again, hard to justify playing it until now with Electrical Cord and Tapu Koko. I think it pairs really nicely with it. All right, what do we got next? We got a white, oh, there it goes, okay. All right, Limitless. We have Fire. So Fire is something we have to respect, right? Because Fire, I spent a lot of time talking last format about how Fire just really wasn't that good. But in this format, I actually think Fire has a pretty good position in the format. I have chosen to show Charizard EX and Turtinator, but there are a variety of different Fire-type decks that you can play. It's tough to know exactly right now what the best options are. I am showcasing the Turtinator Charizard deck. This was my favorite Fire deck of last format, and will probably continue to be a top Fire deck. Not only is Turtinator going to be really good at KOing a lot of those non-EX Pokemon in the Buzzwole deck, like Kartana, like Pheromosa, but it is also going to be able to KO Oricorio, and it can just KO a lot of the Pokemon that, aren't EX Pokemon that we're going to be facing down. And then Charizard EX is really there to deal with all of those EX Pokemon that, of course, Turtinator can't KO. So this deck has its consistency issues, of course, but 2 Lilies, 2 Kiawe, 2 Guzma, 2 Research, 1 Sabrina. This is a deck that kind of just does it all. It's going to be quite strong against Buzzwole, which again is one of the other more common decks of the format. This is definitely a high roll deck that has the potential to beat really any of the decks in the format, which is why I wanted to include it. Now, we could play Turtinator with Incineroar. I think that Incineroar is also a really strong choice to pair with Turtinator. And then we also have the new Blacephalon, which I don't think has necessarily been cracked open completely, but my hopes are actually still high about Blacephalon. I think it's a really, really strong Pokemon. But because it hasn't seen that much play so far, and it's hard for us to know exactly the best way to play Blacephalon, we're kind of reverting back to last format and maybe what the best Fire deck option is in this new format. And to me, that really is Charizard and Turtinator. Of course, we can play Charizard and Incineroar, but Oricorio is definitely still seeing play. And in general, I just don't know if Charizard Incineroar is as well positioned in the format right now, especially with Guzzlord running around. So yeah, I'm not going to recommend necessarily playing Charizard and Incineroar, but I do think Turtinator is actually quite good. So I would definitely recommend playing Turtinator. I think it's definitely a strong choice. And like I said, I think that the Rampardos Sylvally decks are going to be really popular, but the other deck that I think is going to be at the top of the meta share and the top of the popularity charts is going to be Buzzwole, but also Solgaleo. Like we saw a chart I posted, or I guess a graphic, that the game developers showed us a couple days ago, talking about what were the most common decks of last ranked season, and Solgaleo was actually at the top. So I've seen quite a bit of Solgaleo in early ranked right now, and I think that, of course, it's certainly something that you're going to run into. Solgaleo is actually a bit better now in this format than it was in previous formats, so you might end up seeing it play, or it might end up seeing more play than it kind of was previously. So Fire, I think, is actually quite good in the format, and I kind of would recommend playing Fire more than I did last format. So yeah, there's my recommendation for Fire decks. Again, there's so many different Fire type Pokemon in different combinations and stuff, but I think for most people, Charizard EX is kind of like the crown jewel of the Fire type right now, and it certainly is. Like with Stoke, with Lily, it's just really, really strong. It's hard to kind of deal with this thing. You could also play a Giant Cape. There might be some breakpoints that it fixes for you. I'm not necessarily sure, but yeah, Charizard and Turtinator, really, really strong. I would certainly recommend it in the format right now. And again, maybe we don't have any of the new cards, right? Maybe you just didn't really get anything good from, ED Crisis. And yeah, you can just play this old archetype, which is still really, really, really strong. So here it is, Charizard and Turtinator. Definitely one I would recommend. And Fire in general, I think right now is definitely pretty sneaky. Okay, so at the end of the video here, we have 2 decks that I actually kind of have towards the top. Like not also talking about Rampardos and Type Null, but also like 2 other decks that I think are, other than this deck, the other 2 decks that I think are kind of at the top, like my top choices. I put Rampardos and Sylvally at the beginning of my video, but I would also technically, it would be like one of my top 3 decks to choose right now. I just put it at the beginning of the video. So I guess the second to last deck that we're going to talk about is going to be Arceus Giratina and Crobat. Now you can play this with Dark Energies, or you can play it with Dark and Psychic Energies, which I think is actually kind of broken. So yes, this saw play last format, but I still think it's really, really good. Giratina and Darkrai kind of mashed together with Crobat and Arceus. This is just an archetype that does really, really, really well. Giratina and Darkrai can at least handle Rampardos a little bit better, and all of our Pokemon can kind of live an attack from Sylvally, so that is certainly an upside. The only downside to this deck, theoretically, is that if we do lead with a couple of Pokemon that aren't that useful, things like an Arceus or maybe even a Darkrai, it can be kind of difficult to set up. But we are playing 2 copies of Dawn, which means that realistically, no matter which Pokemon is in the active spot, Giratina should be able to enable it with, the Broken Space Bellow, accelerating those Psychic Energies, and then moving them to any of our Pokemon, whether it's Darkrai or Arceus, which have at least one colorless energy in their attack cost. So this is a super, super strong deck. It might even be the best way to play Giratina EX right now. Again, we'll have to see. Tapu lately does still exist. People have kind of stopped playing it for the most part. But yeah, in general, I think this deck is absolutely insane. In fact, I've seen a number of people play this on the ladder and definitely are doing really, really well with it. And like I said, you can play Dark Energies or Dark and Psychic Energies. I don't know if Dark and Psychic is better, but the ability to have those Psychic Energies to attack maybe a turn earlier with Giratina is kind of broken. It really does make this deck really strong. The combo of Cunning Link with Crobat plus the damage we're dealing with Arceus or Giratina is enough to KO most Pokemon in the format. That includes things like a Buzzwole, even with a Leaf Cape and things like that. So even Guzzlord, right, to some extent with the Nightmare Aura Ping. So it's just a lot of damage. And if this deck gets set up, it's just tough to deal with. And it was the kind of the same thing last format. I just don't know if we can really counterplay this deck much because it either draws its Pokemon properly and you just get steamrolled, or it doesn't draw the Pokemon properly and it doesn't really do much. So it is certainly one of those decks that is kind of a high roll deck, but it's hard to counterplay it. It's just inherently strong and it can just kind of beat anything. So that's kind of the upside to playing this deck. I think that as far as sort of those legacy decks go from last format, this might still be one of your best options. So again, I wanted to include it because it's still dominating. It's still a top deck and it doesn't incorporate any of the new Pokemon that came out in the new mini set. So here you go. If you have all of these cards, definitely recommend this deck because it really is incredible. Try it with both Dark Energies and Psychic Energies. I think that could be definitely pretty good if you wanted to lean more into Giratina. This deck is playing 2 copies of Giratina, so maybe it is playing Dark and Psychic Energies, but you could also maybe just cut one Giratina and just play Dark Energies. It really kind of depends. I think that if you're playing the 2 copies of Dawn, 2 copies of Giratina, you probably want to play Dark and Psychic Energies and just sort of ride out with that. That would be my #1 recommendation, but certainly still an incredibly, incredibly strong deck. And I had to showcase it in the video because I think it could end up just being one of the top decks of the format. Okay, lastly is going to be Buzzwole, and we did make a video on Buzzwole yesterday, but I wanted to spend some more time because I've been playing this deck a ton, I've been testing with it a ton, and I have some recommendations as well as some advice as it comes to this deck. Now, I really do think that Buzzwole is actually probably the best deck in the game. It's just so flexible. This deck can do so many different things. No matter what you draw into, no matter what cards you have, you can always find a way to just pop off, right? This is a deck that can utilize Pokemon Center Lady, Erica's Leaf Cape. We're not playing Beastite in this particular list, but I would recommend playing Beastite. And 1 red card, I don't really think Hand Disruption is that needed in this particular archetype. Now, this is a deck list that's playing 2 Kartana and 2 Pheromosa and 2 Celesteela and 2 Buzzwole. Now, in my opinion, we don't need 2 Pheromosa and 2 Kartana. I've seen some people play really every iteration of these 2 cards, whether it's just 2 Kartana and no Pheromosa, 2 Pheromosa and no Kartana, maybe 2 and 1, 1 and 2, whatever the combination is. What I have been kind of recommending right now, and again, all kind of based around the other deck that is seeing so much play, which is Rampardos, you can build this deck to be a really, really strong counter to the Rampardos deck. So some iterations that I would choose to make to this deck list and that I have been playing with this particular archetype is actually cutting Pheromosa. So I know my video yesterday was actually just playing 2 copies of Cyrus and 2 copies of Pheromosa, which I think in general might be the strongest way to play Buzzwole, but with the Rampardos decks seeing a ton of play, what I've actually been playing is 2 copies of Kartana, 2 Buzzwole, 2 Celesteela, and then no Pheromosa. And I've actually been playing no Cyrus and 2 copies of Sabrina. And it actually is a little bit crazy. It allows us to bring up those fossils early on and KO them with Kartana. Kartana also, in my mind, does feel a little bit better if we're playing Beastite. There are scenarios literally where with Beastite and with Red, Kartana can do 80 damage to an EX Pokemon, which has won me games before, which is crazy. Also, Celesteela, if you get 3 energies onto it and you do flip heads, can actually do 100 or 120 with Red to get a KO, which does also come in handy. So this deck list is just really strong. This is one version of it, a kind of a core list, but I would probably recommend playing Beastite. That extra damage does win you games a variety of different ways. You could even play Giovanni specifically for the Rampardos matchup because Buzzwole hits for 140 on Rampardos, but Rampardos, of course, has 150 HP. So a Giovanni would allow us to 1-hit KO Rampardos. That certainly could be really relevant, but also all of our Pokemon hit Rampardos for weakness. The difficult part about the Sylvally matchup is that Pheromosa and Kartana both get KO'd by Sylvally, but Celesteela doesn't. So the whole idea with this deck is that Celesteela just kind of sits into the active spot while we set up our Buzzwole, or we draw into whether it's Kartana or Pheromosa, and then we can go into it. So we can be a little bit protective of our Pokemon until we're ready to use them, and that's a massive upside for this deck. Celesteela plus the single retreat cost of Kartana and Pheromosa allows us to attack with Big Beat, turn after turn, very, very consistently. We can even set up a second Buzzwole really quickly with Lusamine. This deck list is playing one copy of Lusamine, but again, if we were going to cut either a couple Pheromosa or Kartana, you could play 2 Lusamine. You could even play, like I said, Beastite in the deck. So there's a lot of different ways in which we can build this particular deck. This is just an example of a deck that was, I think, a good starting point, playing a lot of different cards. But it did do extremely well in the first day of the Frog EX tournament yesterday, so I did just want to showcase this because I think this is a good baseline. But Beastite is certainly a card to consider, and then honestly, like the Kartana-Sabrina combination is also something to consider with all of the Rampardos fossil decks running around. I would actually kind of maybe recommend that a little bit more, but Cyrus and Pheromosa is still super strong. So this deck is actually flexible in how we can build it, how we can play it, and how we pilot it. It really just is, I think in my mind, the most, I guess, just the best deck, honestly, in the format right now. In my playtesting, it just is crazy. I think people slept on Buzzwole and Celesteela particularly. The ability to kind of choose whichever one of your Pokemon is in the active spot is massive. It's super, super strong. We can kind of dance around and just force our opponent to like have a Cyrus in hand, which is really strong. And then, of course, Buzzwole with Leaf Cape has a ton of HP. It just does everything. It's super consistent, very aggressive, very, very good in the mid to late game as well. Just kind of does everything. It also hits for weakness on Darkrai and Guzzlord and a lot of other Pokemon as well. Rampardos is another one. So I think that Grass is still, or at least right now, is at the top of the metagame. That's my opinion. But there it is. Buzzwole is still kind of my #1 choice right now, honestly. Mainly because we can build this deck to counter Rampardos, which in my mind is kind of the #2 deck. And we are hitting for weakness on things like Darkrai, which does see play. Beastite plus Rat allows us to get KOs on Arceus and Giratina, as well as other Buzzwole. It's just super, super good, honestly. I can't recommend Buzzwole enough. I know it is a deck that plays a ton of the new cards, so it might be difficult for people to build early on, and I understand that. But eventually, I do think that Buzzwole will end up probably being, if not the best deck in the game, one of the best decks. It really depends on how many people are playing Fire, or I guess decks that counter Buzzwole. So we'll have to see. But yeah, I think that for right now, at least for the next couple of days or the next week or so, all of the decks that we showcased in this video are really decks that I would put at the top of kind of my, my list in terms of which decks I would recommend that you guys play. Hopefully this video was interesting to you guys or valuable. I know, again, early on in the format and early in the rank season, it can be a bit difficult to know what decks, I guess, are best or what decks you should be playing. It's a variety of different factors that go into it. At the same time, determining which cards you have available to you, right? Because again, not everybody, is able to get all of the cards early on. So it can be a little bit difficult to navigate, but hopefully this video was useful to you. Some old archetypes that play a bunch of the old cards, some new archetypes that play a bunch of new cards, some just new deck lists in general, new strategies. The metagame has shaken up a ton. It really has. And I think that the Ultra Beast stuff is honestly a bit overtuned. All of the Ultra Beasts, honestly, whether it's like the Buzzwole package or the Dark package, are absolutely insane. It's just, these decks do a lot more than you kind of expect them to, and they're way more consistent and flexible because of Celesteela. I think Celesteela really is like the MVP for all of these Ultra Beast decks, and honestly, whether it's Dark or whether it's Grass, there's a ton of support and just a bunch of great Pokemon that you can pair with it. So those are kind of the two Ultra Beast archetypes in my mind. Dark Guzzlord or Grass Buzzwole, both are really, really strong. And like I said, Electro type is really good. The new fighting improvement is certainly really good. Charizard is really good still. Darkrai and Giratina is still really good still. And then Arceus and Crobat is still really good still. Still good still. Bunch of stills. Yeah, there it is, guys. There's the video. All right, let's get out of here. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Stay tuned. Bunch of content coming in the future. We're going to do, probably tomorrow is probably where we're going to talk about just like all of the new decks that have popped up, right? Because there's a variety of ones. Still a lot of decks that maybe didn't make it into today's video, but are still really fun. Definitely still really good decks, which we'll talk about for sure in the upcoming days. And then, of course, Monday is our first meta report of the new format. And then we go into tier list Tuesday. It's going to be a crazy week, guys. So stay tuned. Like and subscribe. All right. Let's get out of here. Peace out, guys. Have a good one. Yeah. Okay. Bye.